So, good evening everyone. I'm Judy De Winter, Chair of the Royal Free Charity, and I would like to warmly welcome you all here this evening to the Marsden Lecture 2021. I'd also like to welcome you to the Pears Building, which is the inspirational new home of the Institute of Immunity and Transplantation. Over a decade ago, a seed was planted to create a new purpose-built Centre of Immunology, one of the world's largest centres of immunology, to speed up life-saving and life-changing treatments and cures for diseases that affect the human immune system. Thanks to the vision and dedication and commitment of UCL and the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust, and the generosity of our supporters, many of whom are here today, we now have this stunning building from which to have this event tonight. It's named the Pears Building in recognition of the amazing support we've had from the Pears Foundation and the Pears family. So it's thanks to philanthropy that we're able to host this event here tonight, and it's also thanks to philanthropy that the Royal Free Hospital exists. In 1828, a local surgeon, William Marsden, preempted the introduction of the NHS by setting up a hospital free at the point of care. He was moved to act when he witnessed the death of a young woman who was refused treatment because she couldn't afford it, and therefore she couldn't be admitted to hospital. Determined that poverty should not be a barrier to accessing treatment, he rallied his friends and his colleagues, and they contributed to the cost of establishing what we know today as the Royal Free Hospital. William Marsden epitomised and was the pioneer of the philanthropic spirit that is the Royal Free. Tonight's lecture, the Marsden Lecture, is named in his honour. Every year we invite a special guest to give the Marsden Lecture, and this year we're delighted to welcome Dame Kate Bingham, who's going to be introduced to you properly shortly. But I'd like to thank you personally, Kate, for being here tonight and for giving this very important lecture. Thank you. So traditionally, the Marsden Lecture is chaired by the Medical Director of the Royal Free London, and you're going to be hearing shortly from Dr. Chris Drether. I'd also like to welcome Professor Stephen Powis, the National Medical Director of NHS England, who knows this event extremely well, because for many years he chaired this event when he was the Medical Director of the Royal Free London. So welcome, Steve. I'm now going to hand over to the Chief Executive of the Royal Free Charity, John Spires, who's going to run us through some details. But in the meantime, just to say that I hope you have a really enjoyable evening, enjoy the lecture, and thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of all of us at the Royal Free Charity, welcome to the 2021 Marsden Lecture. First of all, can I please ask that if anyone's brought their mobile phone with them, you have your phones on silent. The Pears Building is a working research facility, as many of you have probably spotted already, and that means the operational areas aren't accessible to us this evening, but you are likely to see researchers moving around both outside this room and in the main reception area. Don't be frightened, by all means talk to them and find out what they're working on. There isn't a planned fire drill this evening, so if the alarm sounds, you'll need to exit via the nearest fire exit. For those of you at the back of the room, that's the two doors there. For those of you at the front of the room, it's the two doors here. And the assembly point is down the main path in front of the building, so keep the Pears Building on your right and walk down towards the hospital. It's very clearly marked, and we've got 2 fire marshals with us this evening who are on hand to help us leave quickly and safely and guide us to where we need to be. If anyone feels unwell at any time, just alert a member of staff. The team from the charity have all got the pink lanyards on. There are a number of other staff here from the hospital and from UCL as well, and we'll get you the appropriate help. Toilets are available just outside this room, down on the left-hand side through that door. And to those who are welcoming us, those who are joining us online, a very large welcome. Anyone online who'd like to ask a question to the panel, you can type questions into the Q&A box throughout the talk, and we have a system to get those questions to our panel via Dr. Chris Drether. We are recording the event this evening, and we'll be posting it on the RFC Presents YouTube channel. If you go to that channel, you can also view other speeches and talks from staff across the Trust. Many of you here tonight have been supporting the Royal Free Charity for many years by giving your time, by giving money, and by advocating on our behalf, and I want to thank all of you for that. It's only thanks to that stalwart support that we and the Royal Free London Trust can go beyond the limitations of NHS funding and achieve our joint clinical and research goals. And as Judy's already said, this building we've gathered in tonight is testament to what we can do together when ambition, excellence and philanthropy combine. There's more information about the Royal Free Charity and our incredible work on your seats, and for those watching online, on our website. In a moment, we'll hear from our esteemed speaker, but first, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Strether, the Group Chief Medical Director of the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Judy. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to be brief because you've come here to hear Kate, not me. But I'd like to welcome Dame Kate Bingham, who's going to give this year's Marsden Lecture. I'm feeling slightly nervous because Steve is watching, and Steve was the guardian of the Marsden Lecture for about 12 years, and is very exactly on point about making sure it's done in the traditional way, as it's been done for 200 years. Dame Kate Bingham headed up the UK task force for vaccination for COVID. I think it's easy to say those words, but it's one of those things that I think genuinely was a triumph. You know, our sort of approach to vaccination at a time when we haven't done everything well was I think truly brilliant. And I think what it brings together is science, private sector expertise, and the NHS in a triple act that has been greater than the sum of its parts. Kate's got a career as a biochemist, as an entrepreneur, and then again in government. So she too brings those three things together. I'm really looking forward to what she has to say, and I'd like to welcome Kate and let the Marsden Lecture begin.
How does that sound now? Does that sound all right? Okay, what I thought I'd do is, first of all, say thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind introductions, and it's a real privilege to be here, actually. I live down the road, and my mother, who has severe rheumatoid arthritis, 2 hips and a knee later, is beautifully looked after by a doctor here, Hugh Bainan. And she now swims in the River Wye frequently and is a very active wild swimmer, which is just simply sort of impossible to imagine. And so to get on the swimming theme, my daughter over there was also taught how to swim in the Royal Free Recreation Centre. So this is a very close place to my heart. And so in preparation for this lecture, I thought I would have a look to see if there were any Royal Free connections with my family. So the first slide is already up. And what I discovered was that actually we do have a little bit of connection. So I come from a family, everyone is arts background. So they're all historians and, languages, and nobody has anything that gets close to science, except for my father's side of the family. So the Binghams come from Belfast, from a very modest working class village outside. And Elsie Taylor, so she is my cousin, born in 1928. She qualified at Queen's, Belfast, and had, again, ophthalmic surgery here recently, and with Mr. Jane, which worked very well. And so I told her I was going to come here to do the Marsden Lecture, and she just said, "Oh, well, I used to go to the Marsden Lectures all the time." So it was very familiar to her. And I said, "Well, have you got anything you can tell me about, have we got any connections with the Royal Free?" So first of all, she told me about my paternal grandmother, so Catherine Watterson. And she actually graduated as a doctor at UCL in 1925. And so she was born in 1901. So by the time I was born, she was already 65. So she was always old to me. I never knew her at all. And fortunately, I sit on the board of the Crick. And so I asked David Lomas if he could put me in touch with the archivist. And he did. So he put me in touch with Gaynor and Robert. And so I emailed them and said, any chance that, I mean, I think it's a long shot, but any chance you've got any records of my grandmother? And sort of by return, I get given a photo. I've never seen a young photo of her in my life, and all her records and the bills she paid and everything. But what was interesting, and she won a prize for anatomy. She got the gold medal. And so Elsie told me that that she decided not to take the gold medal, but to take books instead because it was more useful. Anyway, what was interesting is she said, well, of course, my grandmother used to work with Royal Free doctors all the time. And it was fascinating because when she graduated, she said, as a UCH grad, she said, the Royal Free ladies, doctors, think they're better than everybody else. And they are. I mean, it was an astonishing thing. So this is what I'm hearing from the bed up, upstairs. And then she said that, so Elsie, so she was the first in our family to actually have a career and buy a house without getting a house in those days through marriage. And so she was applying to become a junior partner in a GP practice. And she meets this GP practice up in Mill Hill, both of whom were led by Royal Free ladies and doctors. And Elsie told me that they'd have preferred to have had a Royal Free medic, but since Elsie seemed to be the next best thing, she ended up. So she had a very, very warm set of things to tell me about the training of Royal Free doctors, and the fact, again, that the Royal Free is and again, as I've now learnt in part of my research here, is a hospital of first. So it was the first hospital to actually admit women to train as doctors. I mean, that's a phenomenal thing. And you mentioned the fact it was the first hospital to actually how do I do this forward? Back downwards? No, off. Oh, sorry. That way? That's it. It was the first hospital also to accept cholera patients in the 1830s. So this was in a time when all infectious disease patients were turned away. And the Queen Victoria became the patron of the Royal Free, of the London Free Hospital. And at that point, then said, this deserves special recognition because you were brave enough to actually tackle what was a disease that killed 6,500 people in London and turned it in then to the Royal Free Hospital. So this, I thought, was fantastic. And I put this picture up because I'll just read a quote. The disease was something outlandish, unknown, monstrous. Its tremendous ravages so long foreseen and feared. Its apparent defiance of all the known and conventional precautions against the spread of epidemic disease invested it with a mystery and terror. Now, you could say exactly the same thing about COVID, and yet this was about cholera in the 1830s. So, again, in my initial sort of looking at what role does the Royal Free Hospital play, it has a phenomenal background of actually tackling the first to take women, to take infectious disease, and to take some of this whole inventiveness incredibly seriously. So to me, there was no surprise that the Royal Free played a completely critical role in the fight against COVID. So if I now take you back to last year, I received an email from Patrick Vallance, who you all know, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor. His background is academic and then ran research and development at GSK. So he absolutely understands vaccines, discovery, development, manufacturing, all of that. He invited me to join what was then an expert advisory group for vaccines. So my immediate response, again, was, well, what do I know about vaccines? Because I don't know anything about vaccines. And you were far too polite saying I'm a biochemist. I was an undergrad biochemist, and that's as far as it went. And he basically said, we don't have the expertise in government, so we need to bring in some special experts to come and help guide what the government's response should be, specifically thinking about vaccines. And what he wanted from me was a oversight and a horizon scan on what was happening in the small company landscape. So I'm a venture capitalist, and what I do is turn incredibly exciting breaking science into new drugs. So I absolutely understand therapeutics, but there's a difference between therapeutics and vaccines. Therapeutics or drugs, you're taking patients who are sick with something and you're trying to get them better. Vaccines are, you're putting vaccines into healthy people in order to prevent them from getting a disease. So Patrick said, look, please come and help me. So I joined the first meeting and asked at that meeting, and it was full of very prestigious vaccine experts, all the names you've seen in the press. And I said, what is the chance that any of these potential vaccine candidates are actually going to work? And I think it was Richard Hatcher that answered. So he runs CEPI, again, a long-time vaccine expert. And he said he thought for those vaccines that were already in clinical trials, there was a success rate of about 15%. And if they were not yet in the clinic, he thought he had a success rate of about 10%. So it's actually not wildly different from drugs. So the answer is we're starting with a position where most things will fail, if not will fail. And the way these expert advisory groups worked, of Patrick's, is we joined a Zoom call once for 1 hour every other week, which we did throughout April. And it was manifestly clear that that was inadequate. And so Patrick clearly said to the Prime Minister, you've got to do something more than this. So during the, third or fourth of these meetings, I get a text, because that's how government works, is they do everything by text. So I get a text that says, can you speak? And this is, as it turned out, from Matt Hancock. So I said, no, I can't, actually. I'm in the middle of a government vaccine committee, but I'll speak to you after that. So I spoke to him, and he said, we want you to set up a full-time dedicated vaccine task force. And so again, my initial reaction was, as always, why me? I don't know anything about vaccines, all of that, and was completely gobsmacked and shocked by this and thinking, well, how can I leave my job? I mean, how do I do any of that? So I said, well, I'll think about it and I'll call you back. And so I got off the phone, and my daughter then again started giving me a lot of lip and said, Mum, I can't believe that you are saying you can't do it. You were telling me the whole time that I've got to go out there and say yes and put myself out there, and you should, why can't you do this? And so I was quite panicked, I think would be polite. So I called a few people who've worked with government and just said, do you think this is possible? Because again, the chances of this working were very slim. It didn't mean we shouldn't do it, but the cards were definitely stacked against us. And so I decided I would do it. And so overnight, we worked out a bunch of conditions. And the conditions were, I reported to the Prime Minister. There would be a streamlined decision-making. I would be able to hire my own team. And so duly, I get a text, this time from the Prime Minister, saying, can you talk? And so I then speak to him, and he said, it's wonderful, Kate, wonderful, wonderful. You're going to get vaccines, and they're all going to have British flags on them. And I said, I don't think so. I said, they may, but, actually, this is so challenging and so difficult. We need to see if any vaccine will work. And frankly, it doesn't matter where it comes from. We need to make sure it's safe, and we need to make sure it's effective. And so my initial conversation with him was really to say quite how challenging the task was going to be. And so, these are some of the sort of headlines that are important, that no vaccine at that point had ever been developed against any human coronavirus. So we'd had SARS-1, we'd had MERS, people had tried to develop vaccines against it and they had failed. So we had no route for a vaccine against this class of virus that had ever been successful. And of course we knew nothing about the virus. We were pretty sure that it was transmitted as a respiratory virus, but actually we knew very little about the biology and the modes and mechanism of infection. And as I'll get into, the history of vaccine development was not on our side. So the quickest ever vaccine that had ever been developed before was the mumps vaccine, or the latest mumps vaccine, which took 5 years from the definition of the sequence to a vaccine. So that's not a very compelling prospect when the whole country is in lockdown. And of course, vaccines in general are not massively good in elderly. And the people that were suffering most here, the most disadvantaged, were the elderly and the frail. So somehow we had to find vaccines that would be safe, would work in the elderly, with formats that had never been tested. So the most advanced formats, and I'll get into it, the adeno and the mRNA vaccines, had never been approved for use ever. So again, we hadn't got any good roadmap to follow. So those were the challenges we faced in the beginning of last year. And so when I did speak to the Prime Minister, he set out 3 very clear goals. The first was, I want you to get vaccines for the UK as soon as possible. They don't need to be perfect, but get them quickly. And then he said, I want to make sure that any successful vaccine can be distributed internationally to all those that need it. And third of all, I would need you to make sure that we have better plans to deal with this in the future. So there was a very clear emphasis of speed and willingness to take risk. So the first thing we did was to put the team together. And very crudely, the team is split half and half. So half industry experts who come from vaccine or drug discovery, development, regulatory, manufacturing, commercial. And the other half that come from the government, which are procurement, project management, diplomacy. And the best thing, and just completely by chance, is we had another Northwest Londoner. So Nick in the middle there, Nick Elliott, was my Director General. And that basically is the title of the person who's sort of responsible for the government. So he's the senior reporting officer, I'm not sure, SRO I think it was. And Nick started his life as a bomb disposal engineer. So you can just imagine the personality of Nick. It really, you could have fires and bombs going off all around and he would just be calm, and he was great. So the team actually came together really quite well and quite quickly. And I still have not, to this day, met everybody. So we met by Zoom 3 times a week. I put meetings in at 8 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it worked incredibly well. And as part of getting quick decisions, we had a ministerial, what I think of as an investment committee, but a decision-making panel, which were basically the then ministers in business, Treasury, Cabinet Office and Health. And that worked, again, incredibly well. And if we would send full business proposals to this investment committee, and if it was on a Friday night and they had to talk to us at 9 o'clock on a Friday, that's what they did. And they actually worked really well, so that speed of decision-making and government working, I have to say, I mean, I wish it all worked like that, because this was a really good example of how things worked. And everybody on the team had a very clear role, very clear mandate individually, and they got on with it. And so Clive Dix on the middle, on the far left, was my deputy, and he was a former CEO of 2 companies. So I've backed him several times successfully. He used to run research at Glaxo, as it then was, and then became a biotech entrepreneur. So hugely experienced, hugely networked, and between us, we basically knew all the vaccine companies, with the exception of China and Russia. And so we needed introductions, at least for the Chinese. So that worked really well. And then just talking a little bit about the vaccine. So we had a interesting portfolio that we were putting together. So first of all, it had to be a portfolio, because if the chances of any of these vaccines making it were 10 to 15%, you'd need quite a lot of different vaccines to be sure that some would be successful within the portfolio. And so basically what we did is we balanced those vaccines that would be quick to develop, which is the bottom right, but ones about which we had no really good data. And we balanced that, or bookended those, with vaccines that we understood a lot more about, but would be slower to develop. So the quick ones, as you know, are the ones that are around now, which are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. We also included Janssen. So Janssen is a different type of adeno vaccine compared with Oxford. So Oxford's is derived from a chimpanzee, and Janssen is a human-based adenoviral vaccine. So both those 2 bottom ones, and I know I'm speaking to lots of experts, for those of you who are not experts, those are ones where you're delivering a genetic sequence to get the body to make a spike protein. So it's a way of speeding up the manufacture because the body actually makes the spike protein yourself. It gets into the cells and then harnesses the cell's own machinery to make spike. And then we balance that with the top left, which are basically the tried and tested, proven vaccine formats, but they're slower. So you've got protein-based vaccines or peptide vaccines where you're physically just putting in the spike protein, and you put it in with an adjuvant. And an adjuvant is equivalent effectively to a cup of coffee in the morning, so it just wakes up your immune system a bit. And then the whole virus-based vaccine, so that's from Valneva. So we knew those were going to be slower, but we didn't know whether or not the quick ones were going to work. Because they'd never been approved for anything before, we actually had no idea about safety or whether or not you would actually be able to elicit a sufficient immune response. So that's how we built the portfolio. And the first thing, obviously, as we were looking at and evaluating the different vaccines, was to actually find out who needed to be vaccinated. So we spoke to the JCVI, which is the Joint Committee of Vaccinations and Immunisation. So that's the vaccine expert group that advises the government, and said, how many vaccines do you want us to buy? And they said, at that point, and of course things have moved on, but at that point they wanted to vaccinate basically all those people who are vulnerable. So that was all adults over the age of 50 and all other adults with severe underlying disease. And that is about 30 million people. And they said you have to allow for wastage and you have to allow from people that are eligible that won't take it up. And what was astonishing is the wastage, they said, assume 10% and assume only maybe 75, 80% take it up. And those statistics proved to be way out because the wastage was, a fraction of a percent. I mean, it was treated like gold dust, so there was minimal wastage. And there was a much, much, much higher take up. And again, tribute to the NHS and the teams that actually did the vaccine rollout because it's been phenomenal. So that is how we built the portfolio, was basically in groups of 30 million people. So you'll have seen all our initial orders were by and large 60 million doses because there were 2 doses for 30 million people. And in some cases, we also bought options to then continue to buy vaccines. And then just in terms of the numbers, because I know we've got some finance types here, we spent £900 million up front, which actually, in the grand scheme of things, is not very much money. So that was what we spent to basically pay upfront for the manufacturing scale-up and the clinical trials. And that was of a total, again, in my time, a total budget we committed of £3.7 billion. So again, I think compared with the cost of having a closed economy, it wasn't so big, and it was about a little over £10 a dose. So again, not crazy prices for new vaccines. And then what we also did, and this is the one bit I regret a little bit, is neutralising antibodies. So of course there are people who are immunocompromised, whether they are going through severe cancer treatment or HIV or any indication where they basically don't have a functional immune system. And those numbers we were given by the Department of Health was about 500,000 people, so it's a lot of people. And so we also looked at neutralising antibodies, which effectively is an immune response in a syringe. So you can obviously give them therapeutically as an immune response to those people who are infected, but you can also give them prophylactically for those people who can't mount an immune response themselves. And we actually did the work so that we could include the Regeneron antibodies, which we felt were the best ones therapeutically, which have been used here. And we got those included in the recovery study, and again, that played out positively. But we also felt that the AstraZeneca antibody cocktail, was the best for long-acting prophylaxis. So instead of IV delivery, it was actually intramuscular. So it meant it was actually much more amenable for outpatients as opposed to in-hospital settings. And we never managed to get any take-up from the Department of Health on that. And there was, so while they've taken up therapeutic antibodies, we never managed to persuade them that protecting the vulnerable ahead of time was a good thing. So that was I would say was a failure. So the first thing we did in terms of approaching these different vaccine companies was to figure out what it was that we could do to actually support the development of these vaccines as soon as possible. So for all of you guys who have been involved in running clinical trials, you'll know that there are sort of 2 main bottlenecks. The first is getting the regulatory approvals to actually get the trials set up and started. And the MHRA has been completely brilliant and turned it around incredibly quickly. And so the whole red tape was largely removed and trials were set up very quickly. And then the second roadblock is normally how quickly can you actually get bodies into the trials. And so we then set up a national citizen registry, so a vaccine registry on the NHS website that enabled anybody sitting at home to register on the website to consent to be approached about clinical trials. So they weren't agreeing to join the clinical trial, but they were agreeing that they could be approached to be told what clinical trials were available. And what was important again for us on that was that we had to make sure that the people that signed up were representative of those people most at risk. So it was no good having, lots of people that were 25 and fit. We needed to have this enriched for elderly and frail. And we ended up with, and I haven't checked it recently, but it was over 500,000 people signed up, and 35% were over the age of 60. So that was hugely effective. So it meant that when we had trials ready to open, we had a pool of people who had already at least taken the first step towards saying yes, they'd be willing to step up. So in terms of thinking about, the map is just showing where everybody signed up from, and the answer was all over the country. And so it meant that, again, we could enrol all over the country. And we also put a sneaky little question into the sign-up questionnaire, which was to say, would you be willing to be contacted for trials beyond COVID vaccine trials? And 94% said yes. So again, as a tool for potential clinical trials in the future, I think this is hugely helpful. And of course, you want to start expanding it with patients with confirmed diagnoses, and then start working with the patient charities and thinking, how can you actually use this registry to enrol quickly? So that's, I think, a big opportunity for the Royal Free and other hospitals anyway. And then, of course, I then took part in the Novavax trial with Dr. Fiona Burns over here, which, again, was a fantastic example, both of how well the Royal Free worked, but also how well the UK system worked to actually run these trials. So we, just on Novavax alone, we originally agreed to run a trial of 10,000 people, because again, that was our offer, as it were, to these vaccine companies, which was we would do more than just be a customer. We would do whatever we could do to help get that vaccine manufactured and developed and shown to be clinically effective and safe as soon as possible. So they originally scoped out a 10,000 person trial in the UK, which is already a big trial in the UK, and the enrolment and the effectiveness was so good that within, I think, was it 1 week or 2 weeks, they said, could they increase the size of the trial by 50%? And that was going to then become the biggest vaccine trial that was ever run in the UK. And not only were that trial enrolled, it was enrolled in 6 weeks. And we enrolled and completed the study before America even started. So as an example about the nimbleness and the effectiveness, both here, but also around the UK, it was phenomenal. And just the stats on the Royal Free, more than 8,000 people, even during the pandemic, were recruited into clinical trials. A third were into COVID trials. And that is a huge accolade, because that is how you actually push forward the knowledge of medicines, and how do you actually embed research innovations into treatment of patients. So that was hugely good. And the picture you can see is of Vash. So he is one of the vaccinators. And I'm afraid to say that was a fake picture, because for those of you who know, you actually get your first vaccine in this arm. And so this was when the cameras came in, they wanted him to be showing that he was vaccinating, but it's a sham vaccine, as it turned out. But on top of the vaccine trials, and also Fiona Burns also ran the Valneva trial, which is the whole inactivated viral-based vaccine. And again, I think both Novavax and Valneva, so these are the tried and tested, proven vaccine formats. They're less reactogenic, so you're less likely to have, 24 hours or 48 hours of feeling like you've got a bad hangover or flu. So actually, for ongoing vaccine boosts and for children and vulnerable, actually they're probably going to be better vaccines. Now, it'll be up to the government and everybody else to decide what to do, but I think these are going to be really good workhorses. And of course, we'll see where we end up with Valneva, but given that these are whole viral-based vaccines, the first 3 types of vaccines are just eliciting an immune response against the spike protein. And of course, if at some point there may be sufficient escape mutants against spike, that will no longer be effective. Whereas if you have a whole viral-based vaccine, you just grow up the new mutant vaccine or the new variant, and then that again becomes your vaccine. So we'll see where that gets to. I also put recovery and the remap cap. So those are 2 examples of, again, game-changing trials that were run here at the Royal Free and around the country. So recovery, you again will have seen in the press, but this was what's called a master protocol. So where you have one arm, which is a placebo arm, and then you have 6 arms, all of which are identical in terms of design, but testing different potential therapeutics. And what the recovery trial showed was definitively that steroids work for certain types of patients, and that tocilizumab works. But importantly, that certain treatments that were being promoted by certain politicians did not work. And that was phenomenally important, game-changing data, which again was led out of here and out of hospitals around the UK. And there was a recent publication in Nature by Janet Woodcock, who was from the FDA, which is the US regulator. And she gave data to show that only 5% of the therapeutic COVID trials run in the US generated actionable data. 5%. So that meant 95% of patients enrolled in US clinical trials did not generate any data that was useful. Now that is shocking. And yet we've got over 10% of patients that caught COVID that came to hospital were enrolled in the recovery trial. So it just gives you a scale of when, as you said at the beginning, that the combination of where you've got academia, NHS, industry and government all working together, it can be incredibly effective. And there is no question that these trials have altered the course of how COVID is treated around the UK. Also, I think it was anecdotal data that came from the Royal Free on the Regeneron cocktail, which was very helpful because you certainly had patients here that just couldn't rid the COVID. And when we managed to secure some Regeneron cocktails, you managed to clear them and they went home. So that was great. And of course, you've been running vaccination hubs here as well. So the other thing that the Royal Free did, which is I was involved in, which is really exciting, is what's called human challenge. So this is where you deliberately infect young, fit, healthy people with the COVID virus to basically get a sense of, do the vaccines or the therapeutics actually work? But importantly, what is the mechanism of protection and also the mechanism of infection? So in this case, you want the opposite. You don't want elderly, frail, vulnerable people. You want young, fit, healthy. And you can only start doing that when you've got what's called rescue therapy. So you need to know that in case somebody actually gets seriously infected, you can actually treat them so that you can bring them back. But the reality is you don't actually infect enough that they ever get symptoms. You get enough that you can actually detect the virus and then you take them out. So the reason this is important is you understand the biology of infection. You can actually start to assess the next generation vaccines and therapeutics in a way that you can't with the big wild type trials. So you can run trials like we did last year when there's infection because people naturally get infected by walking around. But now you can't run those sorts of trials because there's much less virus. I mean, there is still some, but you'd have to run enormous trials to be able to show any data. Whereas in a deliberate infection model, you can do it. Now, it's slightly artificial, of course, but this, again, we ran the first ever, world's first human challenge studies for SARS-CoV-2 here in the Royal Free, together with Imperial and hVivo, which is a specialist company that does this. And that established the model. And this is going to be fundamentally important to really understand the future of how next generation vaccines and drugs, and in due course for other pandemics. So this is important. It hasn't been taken up as much as again I would like, but in due course it will be. And then the other aspect of our offer to the vaccine companies was to say, how can we actually help you manufacture these different vaccines? So we started in the UK with a position where there was no bulk capability of vaccine supply. We had small companies, but no real capacity. So what we needed to do was to basically supercharge the existing manufacturing facilities that were in the UK, but we needed to maintain flexibility because we didn't know which of any of these vaccine formats was going to work. So we worked, and you can see I put a whole bunch of logos on here. We worked with a bunch of contract development manufacturing organisations, that's what they do for a living. They manufacture advanced therapies. So Oxford Biomedica, Cobra, Fuji, they were all existing manufacturers of advanced medicines. We bought a veterinary vaccine plant, which was quite fun. One morning in Wales, I got a call saying, do you want to buy it? And I was thinking, well, that might be quite good. Let's go and have a look. And so we bought that, upgraded it obviously to human use, and that is now being managed by the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. And so that's good. And then we both upgraded the Valneva facilities and actually then built a new site, a new plant. So we've actually got, and then there's one other government organisation, CPI, the Centre of Process and Innovation, which we funded to get to a GMP standard mRNA vaccine manufacturing capability. So we basically ended up with an ability that for those smaller vaccine companies that needed help to actually do the scale up and bulk manufacturing, we could offer that. For the bigger guys, they largely didn't need it, but we also put in place a what's called fill finish capacity. So the first thing you need to do is to make the vaccine, but then you've actually got to put them into vials, and that's a separate step which is equally complex. And we didn't know what we were going to need to basically bottle, so we basically just bought an 18-month contract for fill finish and said we will figure out in due course what it is we're going to put in there, but we know we need that capability. And as it turned out, fill finish turned out to be highly constrained worldwide, so it was incredibly helpful that we had it. And it also gave us the flexibility when we went out to talk to vaccine companies that we could receive vaccine in bulk, so that they didn't have to do the fill finish themselves. We could say, well, ship it, and we'd obviously need regulatory consent and everything, but ship it in bulk and then we'll do the fill finish. So that was all. I think our team, manufacturing guys, just played a complete blinder on a manufacturing. And this normally it takes years to scale up vaccines. And the idea that we went from, Oxford they designed their vaccine in 65 days and they were approved within a year. It is quite astonishing. And you have to make big decisions and jumps to go from the sort of test tube scale up to these big bulk, 1,000, 2,000 litre scales. And of course, there were bumps along the road, and nobody, by and large, got as quick as their sort of rose-tinted expectations. But it was completely phenomenal. And if you look now, you won't be able to read that very easily, but this is the vaccines that have been now scaled up as of November or so. There have been 8 billion doses that have been manufactured to date. 8 billion doses from basically nothing. So roughly the world is operating at about a 1.3 billion dose monthly run rate of vaccine manufacture. And what I am really excited about is the top purple line is the Chinese. So that's Sinovac, and that's a whole inactivated virus-based vaccine. But the next two lines are the Oxford vaccine. And we're talking here about AstraZeneca stepping in to manufacture this university academic vaccine. They are not a vaccine company, and yet they have managed to manufacture more vaccine than everyone else in the world apart from the Chinese. So they've manufactured over 2 billion doses. It's now been distributed to over 170 countries around the world. Over 20% of the global vaccines are the Oxford vaccines. And it's being done up until now at non-profit. So it's been a phenomenal success story, actually. And if you look, for example, at some of the smaller companies, so just below Oxford is the Pfizer-BioNTech. And then below that are all much, much smaller. And so the Moderna, Janssen, and so on. So again, I think we played a small part in that, not the whole thing, but we certainly helped get it on the map. And then, of course, the really exciting thing was on the 8th of December, we started vaccinating. So you've all seen, Margaret Keenan's photograph. And that was just a very, very exciting day. It's actually a month before is when we heard the first data that came out of Pfizer. And that was phenomenal because we didn't know. We knew that we were eliciting an immune response because we had that data earlier on. What we didn't know is whether or not the immune response that we were generating would be sufficient to be protective. And when we got that Pfizer data, it was way beyond what we ever expected. And we were having sort of gloomy conversations because the US regulator, the FDA, had said that they wanted a cutoff at 50% vaccine efficacy. It's basically what you get with flu. And we were thinking, well, look, if these vaccines are safe, but they're only 30% effective, do you think the regulator would approve it? And my view is they probably would, if you could show they were safe. But we were still very much in there. Do you think we'll meet 50%? And, will we get there? And so then when Pfizer came out with 90%, it pretty much signalled that it was likely that most of the vaccines we had purchased were likely to work at some level. Not necessarily all at that 90% level, but the whole prospect of them all failing was pretty unlikely. And what I think was really exciting is the real world evidence. So actually, how are the vaccines actually working when you start giving them at a population level? They're basically working as we saw in the clinical trials. And you never see that. Normally in clinical trials, you get much better data because you've got very controlled conditions and people you're bringing into the trials. And in this case, we're seeing basically the same data. And so far, touch wood, we are seeing all the vaccines being effective against the different mutant strains. And so far, we are in very good shape. And again, I think the JCVI made some very good calls on the whole vaccination strategy. So much to the criticism of the whole world, we spread out the dosing interval. If you remember, their recommendation was to vaccinate as many people as we could and delay the second dose for 12 weeks. Now, we are sitting here in the Institute for Immunology, so with the immunologists around here, we would all know that actually delaying the second dose is a good idea. You're likely to have an improved immune response. But of course, that wasn't how the trials were designed. You want to get the vaccine approved and out into people's arms as quickly as possible. So you're not going to optimize the dosing interval because that would take too long. So you basically do the opposite. You have as short a dosing interval as you can, show the vaccine works, and then you can start showing that actually by delaying the dosing interval, you can improve things. But the fact that the JCVI called it, and if you remember, it was like January last year, and if you go back and look at the press, with everyone saying, this is outrageous, and there's no evidence, and you can't do that because the trials were 3 weeks or 4 weeks apart, and therefore you shouldn't be doing it, it was exactly the right call. And again, they also made a decision to say we need to prioritise the over 80s before we do the healthcare workers and so on. And I think, again, those were very successful. And then the heterologous boost, so sort of mix and match, those are trials that are now underway and I think are going to prove also to be effective. Oh, but just on that slide, you can't really see it in the bottom left, but for those of you who are the sort of number crunchers, World in Data produced maps and stats on COVID vaccinations and cases and everything. And this was a wonderful map right at the beginning on the 8th of December where the UK was the only country that was actually vaccinating. So this is where we are in terms of status now. So populations vaccinated around the world. So although we were very good on the 8th of December, we are down a bit now. So the UK, you can see, is this one here. So when we're not in the top 10, or maybe just in the top 10 of percentage of population, but you can see we've been very active on getting the boosters. So we were very quick to get going. We're been slower, I think, partly because there hasn't been a mandated vaccination of children, and that's unlike the US and the European Union. I think probably people are just a bit tired and stopping getting excited. But vaccine hesitancy, by and large, has not been a major issue. So although the anti-vaxxers get headlines. It's actually not a huge issue as it might suggest. And then in terms of, I've just put this in, so COVAX, that was our second goal, was to actually deliver doses to the rest of the world, or to ensure that vaccines were delivered to the rest of the world. UK made a lot of good pledges, we just haven't delivered very much yet. So there was a £500 million pledge to COVAX, which is the global facility. But we've only actually delivered 11% of also the additional 100 million doses. And at the moment, 4% of Africa is vaccinated. And the last stat I saw was there were only a few more vaccines that were sent to Africa versus California. So we're not in a great position here, and we just have to do things better. And I think one of the ways we'll do things better is actually just by having better vaccine formats. Because at the moment, everybody has to have 2 jabs, a fixed, a period apart. They have cold chains, they're complex. And actually, if you could have a pill, a patch, a spray, it'd be a much easier way. You could get your vaccine in the post. And that would be just a much better way. The costs of deployment in the UK are the same as the cost of buying the vaccines. So we spent about £4 billion on vaccines, and the cost to actually put those into people's arms here in the UK is about £4 billion. We also need to obviously scale up manufacturing around the world. That does not mean that every country has to have its own manufacturing capability, but it does mean we need to have more capability and capacity, ideally in low-income countries, because there's always going to be a tension between the governments wanting to vaccinate their own citizens versus actually exporting, exactly as we've seen here. And actually, if you could have lots of big plants in low population countries, they can deal with their own citizens and then they can export. And then, of course, we need to have broad treatments, which are now coming through, so the antivirals and the antibodies. So just because I am a venture capitalist, everything I see is through a venture capital lens. And so I think the reason we were successful in doing what we were doing is all the sorts of things that I think about as a venture capitalist. So it's about having the strong industry networks and relationships, so you can just pick up the phone and you can speak to people and you speak the same language and then you know each other. And you work as partners, not as adversaries. So a classic government approach to buying things is it's a sort of traditional procurement approach where you line all the things up and you compare them all and you rank them and then you work out what they're going to cost and you say, well, I'll have that one. And we couldn't do that. We didn't have the data. They're all coming out at different times and different speeds, and they had different data. And the data, by and large, was not comparable. Even the neutralizing antibody data was not comparable because they all use different techniques and different assays. So that was something else we did. So accepting that we were going to have losses was something that was really important, and something that, again, governments are not that used to know that, for every pound you spend, a portion of that is going to be lost, and which we obviously did by building a portfolio. So I think those were sort of some of the key things that really worked for us, as well as having an expert team that was empowered to actually do the job. And one of the things I absolutely noticed within government was there was a very strong focus on process, and almost didn't matter what the outcome was. They just wanted to make sure they'd followed the right steps. Whereas I didn't really care what the process was. I just wanted to make sure we got the right outcome. And in a way, coming with no knowledge of government at all, or government processes, was incredibly helpful. Because it meant I could just say, well, I think we should do this. And they'll give me all the reasons why you can't. And then I said, well, I don't really care. If that's going to be how we're going to solve it, we need to do it this way. And so, to be fair, they adapted and it all worked. But I think if I'd come in with these are the rules that you have to follow, I doubt it would have been as effective as not knowing the rules or ignoring them when I did know them. Government was fantastic. So, yes, I think there's been all sorts of issues in other parts of the pandemic response. But actually, as far as I was concerned, I got everything I needed. I was able to hire. I was able to act quickly. We didn't take any spending decisions, but we had a very quick mechanism to get those spending decisions made. And when we had needed quick decisions from government on things like specific terms in the contracts, we got it. So that, I think, really worked very well. And of course, we had to execute quickly. So again, it was very helpful that we had a mandate that said do things quickly. And long-term thinking, I think, is one of the issues that we're not seeing so much now, because I think we're reverting a bit back more to the sort of, this is, you know, how we work in government, rather than thinking what is the long-term capability we want to leave in the UK. So I'm optimistic we're in a better position than we were, but I think we have some way to go before we'll be in a great position. So that was what I was always going to say, and I'm happy to take questions. Is that what we're going to do now?
Hopefully I can do this without too much feedback. Enormous thanks to Dame Kate for a fascinating lecture. I think we're all going to leave inspired, fascinated, and of course enormously proud of just how much of the work that went on was down to incredible things happening a very, very short distance from the room that we're in today. It's fair to say that last year we at the charity were simply overwhelmed by the response of our local communities. Whether that was as volunteers, as donors, as participants in trials, a huge amount of support came into the charity to help us deal with the challenges posed to the NHS. The public stepped up, I think, in a truly incredible way, and that meant we were able to step up ourselves as the charity and provide a raft of supports to help the Trust deal with the immediate response to the pandemic. Our new appeal, which some of you have talked to us about already this evening, shifts the focus onto the longer term challenges that we face. We're calling on our supporters, old and new, to join us and help raise vital funds to speed up the Trust's programme of improvement and innovation as we recover. Our appeal, which is called Breaking Point, highlights the longer term impact of the pandemic on our staff and our patients. We're putting centre stage the physical, the emotional and the psychological effects that's having on our workforce and on the patients that we care for. It's fair to say that we are going to face a tough winter, and we want to do all that we can to help now. You can find information on that appeal in the packs on your chairs, and for those who are joining us from home, you can visit royalfreecharity.org to find out more. Particularly excitingly, this weekend, we will be launching a time-limited matched funding phase of the appeal using a crowdfunding platform called Charity Extra. You can see that on social media, and many of you may well be asked by your friends, family and colleagues to make a gift. If you are able to help us with a donation or by sharing news about the appeal, we'd be enormously grateful. Thank you as ever to all of you here and online for your continued support. A very big thank you again to Dame Kate, and I want to say a particular thank you to the really large number of people across the charity, the Trust and UCL who've made tonight possible.